There's also much more money in the capital markets. So the capital markets has over $14 trillion, the global capital markets. Now there's a strategy to access global capital markets. That is the strategy that some of you may qualify for if you're interested, if you have businesses that meet a certain standard. But one of the areas that we advise people and we support people to do is to acquire. You can acquire a listed company in New York. The Chinese have been doing it for years. There are over 10,000 Chinese companies that are listed in different exchanges in the United States, and they are accessing US capital. Once you are listed in the US, you can access US capital. But the strategy is to acquire. If you try to go the other route, which is to get listed through the long way, most likely you won't be able to achieve it because the criteria, they will tell you to go bring your grandmother and the great-grandfather. But if you do it through an acquisition, then it's a leapfrog strategy. And we can support with that. But the one we want to get you interested in is the $250 billion, which is coming from bilateral funding, funding from countries, Exim banks, and so on and so forth. Almost every country that is interested in this African market, remember I told you the size of the African market. So if I am talking about it, then you can be rest assured that the smart guys in Europe and United States are also talking about it. So they know that African market is growing. And that is why there's a lot of interest in Africa. So the United States has put some money aside for Africa. Canada has put some money aside. China has put, in fact, Japan even announced recently they are also putting $50 billion aside for Africa. Next week, Russia is holding an Africa conference. Our president is going for that. They are going to also announce how much they are putting aside. So that everybody is interested in Africa. There's money for business in Africa. But you have to have a strategy. And that is the global capital strategy that we are talking about. So if you don't have the strategy, you will rush to them and they will send you back because you don't know what they are looking for. So there must be a strategy. Okay? So I'll just give you a little bit more details. Who is eyeing Africa? Now, China's Belt and Road Initiative has huge potential for Africa. China has invested over $900 billion across the world in projects. And in direct opportunities in Africa, they invested over $43 billion in 2017. The figures for 2018 were not available. Now, if you compare that with Japan, Japan has only invested about $9 billion. So China is much more aggressive. $204 billion of China's volume annual trade with Africa. So they're doing about $204 billion in annual trade. And then Japan, if you compare that, is doing just about $17 billion. So again, there's much more interest coming from China. Then in the US, they are also eyeing Africa. They set up their Prosper Africa initiative. They set up a new development finance corporation with a capital base of $60 billion. And they are looking at Africa in a very serious way. The European Union, I talked about the generalized system of preferences. And then there's the European Union Investment Plan, which is the Africa-European New Partnership for Jobs and Investment, $40 billion in funding. Then Japan, Great Britain, France, I think Germany announced about $10 billion. You know, so it is collectively that we looked and said it's about $250 billion. There's a criteria to access these funds. Most cases, you have to be willing to buy technology from the country that is providing the fund. But that's just the first criteria. There are many more criteria that you need to meet in order to get that. So we look and we developed a business development matrix if we're going to support you and if we're going to help you, and we look at it from three prospects: from the local market, from the African market, and from the global market. Now, under the local markets, we have what we call the local content strategy. The local content strategy. What? The local GDP, local service industries, and then the modular enterprise strategy. So local content strategy means basically a demand for local inputs in commanding heights. So if you want to have a local content strategy, you have to, first of all, make sure that there's a policy in place to support that strategy. In many cases, there is. So in Nigeria, for instance, there's a local content policy in place in the oil and gas industry. And in a few other industries, they're beginning to consider local content strategy. If you have a local content strategy in the oil and gas industry, and you have been able to get access to projects, or you're positioning for projects, then it's likely that you're on the right path because you will get international funding. So they look out for that, because all you do is you support your proposal with the local content law, and it shows that you are going to be consistently in the game. Now, in terms of the local GDP, in some cases, the local GDP can enhance your ability to do extensive and sustainable business. I'll give you a typical example of these two strategies working hand in hand. So a country like Mozambique, for instance, which I'll be talking about a little bit down the road, has a very small GDP. I think it's about $5 to $6 billion. But Mozambique also has some of the largest investments coming into Africa ever. There's about $60 billion in investment coming into Mozambique. So if you're in Mozambique and you're playing against the local content strategy, you will win. But you will not win if you're playing against the local GDP, because the local GDP is small. So that is what I'm talking about, so that you can see the correlation between the two. Then if you have a local service industry, so for instance in Nigeria, there are a couple of industries that have huge potential for services, and I have listed them here. Demand side: healthcare, education, legal, and entertainment. In healthcare alone, Nigerians spend over $500 million in getting treatment in India, Dubai, Cyprus, and so on and so forth. So it's a huge industry. So if you have a plan to provide world-class medical facilities in Nigeria, they know that the market is there, because Nigerians are spending this money abroad. So it means that that market can support your plan. Then there's the modular enterprise strategy. I'm going to talk about that towards the end of the presentation, but we use this because it's not every time that you want to set up a project or a business and you want to do it big. You have to crawl before you can walk. Wouldn't you agree? You have to walk before you can run. So we look at the modular enterprise strategy and say, why don't you start small and then take it to the next level? And then when you're using modular enterprises, you can just add modules to the manufacturing line, as opposed to starting pretty big and getting bogged down with huge capital requirements. Then the next category is the African markets. So we talked about local markets, right? So the next one is the African markets. And then the African markets, we have what we call the Africa content strategy. So again, I use Mozambique as an example. As you can see, Mozambique has two major projects. One is the Anadaco Total LNG project, $49 billion. And then you have the Mobile, which is the ExxonMobil project, which is $33 billion. The two projects are expected to be investing over $100 billion over the next 10 years. So it is now touted as Africa's largest investment destination. This is a small country with almost an insignificant GDP. Is now going to have this huge investment in their gas industry. So we call it the Africa Content Strategy because they now need support from their African brothers because they can't chop all this money alone, can't they? So we need to go there and support them because Mozambique does not have a strong local business community. So we're actually going in January. We're going to go in January with quite a number of people so that we've spoken to the government, we've spoken to the people in Total and Mobile, and we're going to make sure that we position Nigerian companies, some Ghanaian companies and so on, to take advantage of the opportunities in Mozambique. DRC has a huge project as well, the Grand Inga project, and then Ghana has the Aviation City. So in all, and in conclusion, as far as the modular enterprises are concerned, they have over $150 billion available. And I'll give you a little bit insight in that towards the end. Then the Africa Free Trade Agreement, the Continental Free Trade Area, that is going to be focused on consumer products and consumer product value chains. There's going to be huge investment or huge inroads into our market, us into their markets in education, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, furniture. And the people involved in fast-moving products. How many of you are in the hall today? Say aye. So there are quite a number. Okay, so your marketplace is going to have a lot of interest, as you would imagine. So, and like I said, it can go both ways. So we'll be very, very interested in talking to you. Then there will be huge interest in additional machinery, plants, equipment, spare parts, and so on and so forth. And then transportation, that is an overlooked one because a lot of these goods and services will need to be transported between these countries. So transportation will explode, both ground and air transportation. You're going to have a lot of investment and opportunities growing in that place. Then the next one is the global market. So I talked about local market, I talked about the African market. Then there's the global market. Now, under the global market is what we call the global market strategy, global supply chains, global free trade area agreements, AGOA, which is the one from the US, and then most importantly, we have to have what we call a China strategy. I call it the China strategy. Now, what do I mean by that? In the next 2 to 3 years, China is going to be listed as a high-income country. So China has moved out of developing nation status. They are now the number 2 economy in the world when you use normal standards. If you use purchasing power parity, China is the number 1 economy in the world. They've already surpassed the United States. But in 2 years' time, everybody will agree. So some people don't agree that they have surpass the US. So they're still listing China at $11, $12 trillion. They're not using PPP. But by 2 years' time, China will overtake the US. And it will be considered a high-income country. Now, what are the implications of this? The implications of this is that when you become high-income country, what happens? Huh? You become rich, right? You don't want to clean the floor anymore. You have to hire somebody to clean your floor, isn't it? Huh? So a lot of factories in China will no longer have Chinese laborers because they are too rich to man those factories. So the calculation is that China will need to transfer 85 million jobs to lower income countries in order to remain competitive. So thousands of Chinese factories are going to need to move out of China. So Chinese entrepreneurs, Chinese business people are currently looking at where they will move these factories as we speak. They're looking at Cambodia, they're looking at Vietnam. We want them to look at Nigeria. We need to put our acts together and we need to put our house in order. Because if we miss this wave, then we are missing out on 85 million jobs. Just to tell you what is possible, I've listed it there. In 1978, China's GDP per capita was $154. $154. Nigeria was higher than China at that time. China was lower than 33% of African countries. Today, their GDP per capita is $7,500. And like I said, they are moving into high income. They'll soon hit $10,000. In 1980, their total GDP was $300 billion. Today, it is over $11 trillion. So, what I'm saying is that it is possible to leapfrog because countries have done it. But China was able to do it because they were able to become the manufacturing base of Europe and the United States. So the way we need to position now is to become the manufacturing base for China, because those companies still have their markets in the Europe and the United States. They just need to know where they will set up their factories and employ labor. So I'll just give you an example of where are Chinese 85 million jobs. Where can it go? So we have 126 million unemployed people in Africa, but Nigeria, we have just 20.9 million unemployed. So if we strategize well, we can wipe out our unemployment line in 3 years if we position for these China jobs. We can wipe it out in 3 years. According to the IMF, measured by purchasing power parity, China has already surpassed the United States. I said that already. In terms of the size of its economy, China currently accounts for 18% of global GDP. One country accounting for 18% of global GDP. In 2011, China produced more cement than the United States has used in the entire 20th century. This is true facts, just so you know how fast that country is growing, and we ignore them at your own peril. In 2011, a Chinese firm built a 30-story skyscraper in 15 days. Yes. In 2014, another company topped that. They built a 57-story building in 19 days. China has built the equivalent of the entire European housing stock in 15 years. That means all the houses in all of Europe put together. China was able to do that in 15 years. So they're growing like mad. You know, their high-speed rail can stretch from Cape Town to Cairo and back twice. They have over 12,000 miles of rail. Let's look at Nigeria. Those of you who know me will know that I am an optimist. So I'm not going to give you the negative side. Okay? So I'll give you the optimistic side. There are opportunities in Nigeria. We know that there are 20 million houses that are needed. We know that 5 million bed spaces are needed for students across the country. So this is so that you know, I'm just giving you a tidbit of the kind of ideas that will attract global capital.